Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Horizon and watched the empty space ahead. 3 days ago, New Haven Colony had sent a message that made his blood run cold. The transmission lasted only 12 seconds before it cut off completely. Since then, nothing but silence came from the world that housed 40,000 human souls. Maria Santos checked her equipment one more time as the ship moved closer to the planet. She led the best reconnaissance team in the fleet, but something about this mission felt different. The silence from New Haven was not like a broken radio or failed power grid. It was the kind of silence that meant something terrible had happened. The planet looked normal from space. Green continents and blue oceans spun slowly beneath white clouds. The orbital stations were still there, but they too remained silent. No ships moved between them. No lights blinked on their hulls. Jake ordered the Horizon to move closer while his crew prepared for the worst. Alex Bennett studied his readings from the science station. As the ship's expert on alien life, he had seen many strange things during his years in space. But the energy readings from New Haven made no sense. Massive amounts of power had been used on the planet's surface just 3 days ago. The kind of power that could level entire cities. Ryan Torres prepared his security teams for landing. As chief of ship security, he had trained for many situations. Pirate attacks, equipment failures, even first contact with hostile aliens. But the reports from other colonies had mentioned strange ships in the area, ships that did not match any known human or friendly alien design. The Horizon entered orbit around New Haven and began scanning the surface. The main city of Haven Prime appeared on the screens, and Jake felt his heart sink. Where 40,000 people had lived and worked, only empty buildings remained. The streets were clear of any movement. No vehicles moved between the structures. No people walked the paths that had been busy just days before. Maria took her team down to the surface in a shuttle. The landing pad was clean and undamaged, but completely empty. As they stepped out of the shuttle, the silence hit them like a physical force. Cities were supposed to have sounds. Traffic, machinery, voices, life. New Haven had none of these things. They walked through the main street of Haven Prime and found the first signs of what had happened. Strange burn marks covered some of the buildings. The marks were perfectly round and went deep into the metal and stone. Whatever had made these marks used energy weapons far more advanced than anything humans possessed. Ryan led his team to the government building where the colony's leaders had lived and worked. Inside, they found the first bodies. Men, women, and children who had been killed quickly and efficiently. The energy weapons had left no blood, just clean holes where life had been taken away. Whoever did this had shown no mercy to anyone. Alex studied the burn marks and weapon damage with his scientific equipment. The energy signatures were unlike anything in human records, but they matched some old files about a species called the Zephyrians. These aliens had been peaceful traders with humanity for over 20 years. They sold rare materials and bought human art and music. Nobody had ever seen them as a threat. The team moved deeper into the city and found more evidence of the attack. The aliens had been systematic and thorough. They had gone building by building, room by room, making sure that no human survived their visit. The few security cameras that still worked showed crystalline ships landing in the city center and tall, thin figures in silver suits walking through the streets. Maria found the underground emergency shelters beneath the city hall. The heavy doors had been forced open with energy weapons, but inside they discovered something that gave them hope. Survivors. 12 people had hidden in a deeper bunker that the attackers had not found. They were scared, hungry, and traumatized, but they were alive. The survivors told a story that chilled everyone who heard it. The Zephyrians had arrived without warning in ships that looked like floating crystals. They had demanded that all humans leave the planet immediately. When the colonists refused and asked for time to contact Earth, the aliens had begun their systematic murder of every person they could find. The attack had lasted 6 hours. The Zephyrians showed no emotion as they killed. They did not take prisoners or slaves. They did not steal anything valuable. They simply removed every human from New Haven as if they were clearing out unwanted insects from a building they wanted to use. Jake Morrison looked at the reports from his teams and felt something he had never experienced before. Pure rage burned in his chest as he thought about the children who had died for no reason except that they were human. The Zephyrians had crossed a line that should never be crossed. They had committed genocide against innocent people who had never threatened them. The news of New Haven's destruction spread quickly through human space. On Earth, military leaders began emergency meetings. In the colonies, people demanded answers and protection. Admiral Kate Sullivan received orders to mobilize the fleet while diplomats tried to contact the Zephyrian government. But Jake Morrison already knew that talking would not be enough. As he looked down at the empty city below, he understood that humanity had been given a message. The Zephyrians wanted humans to know that they were no longer welcome in this part of space. They had chosen to deliver that message with the blood of 40,000 innocent people. The silence of New Haven would echo across the stars, but it would not be the last sound that humans made in response to this attack. 3 weeks after the discovery at New Haven, Ambassador Lisa Carter sat in the meeting room at Crossroads Prime Station. This neutral space station had hosted peace talks and trade agreements for decades. Today, it would host something very different. The Zephyrian delegation had finally agreed to meet with human representatives to discuss the massacre. Lisa had been a diplomat for 15 years. She had negotiated mining rights, settled trade disputes, and even helped end a small war between 2 alien species. But she had never sat across from beings who had murdered 40,000 innocent people. Her hands remained steady on the table, but her mind burned with controlled anger. The Zephyrian delegation entered the room like walking statues made of crystal and metal. Their leader, who called itself Crystalline Prime Vexthara, stood nearly 8 feet tall. Its body reflected light in strange patterns, and its voice sounded like music played on broken glass. Behind it, 4 other Zephyrians took their places without any sign of emotion. Vexthara spoke first, and its words shocked everyone in the room. It explained that New Haven had been destroyed as part of a necessary cleaning operation. The Zephyrians had decided that humans were spreading too quickly through space. They were taking planets and resources that the Zephyrian collective wanted for their own expansion. The massacre had been meant as a clear message. Lisa kept her voice level as she asked about the women and children who had died. Vexthara replied that age and gender were meaningless concepts when dealing with an infestation. Humans were pests that needed to be removed from areas that the collective claimed. The deaths at New Haven were no different from spraying insects. In a building, the Zephyrian ultimatum was simple and brutal. All human colonies beyond the Sol system had 1 solar rotation to evacuate completely. Any humans found on these worlds after that deadline would be eliminated just like the colonists at New Haven. The collective would not negotiate this demand or accept any alternative proposals. Lisa ended the meeting and sent an emergency transmission to Earth. Within hours, President John Hayes had called together the United Earth Council for an emergency session. Representatives from every human world gathered in the Great Assembly Hall to hear the Zephyrian demands and decide humanity's response. General Paul Martinez presented intelligence reports that painted a terrifying picture. The Zephyrians had been building a massive war fleet while maintaining peaceful relations with humanity. Their crystalline ships used energy weapons and shield technology far superior to human military equipment. They had been planning this expansion for years while pretending to be friends and trading partners. Some council members argued for negotiation and compromise. They suggested that humanity could evacuate the outer colonies and focus on developing the inner systems. They pointed out that fighting the Zephyrians would likely result in the complete destruction of human civilization. The smart choice was to accept the ultimatum and save as many lives as possible. But the majority of the council felt very differently. Admiral Kate Sullivan stood before the assembly and spoke words that would be remembered for generations. She said that humanity had not crawled out of caves and crossed the void between stars just to run away when bullies threatened them. The people of New Haven had died because they were human, and no human anywhere would be safe if this genocide was allowed to succeed. President Hayes called for a vote, and the result was overwhelming. Humanity would not abandon the colonies. They would not accept genocide as the price of peace. Every human military unit would be mobilized to defend the outer worlds. Operation Steel Thunder would begin immediately with the goal of showing the Zephyrians that humans would fight for their right to exist. Nina Clark worked in the intelligence division and had been tracking Zephyrian movements for months. Her reports showed that the aliens had already begun moving against other human settlements. Long-range scouts had detected crystalline ships near 3 different colony systems. The Zephyrians were not waiting for their deadline to expire before continuing their campaign of extermination. Admiral Sullivan received authorization to deploy every available warship in human space. The fleet included massive battleships, fast destroyers, and countless smaller vessels that could be armed for combat. Even civilian ships were being modified to carry weapons and serve as support vessels for the military fleet. The mobilization of humanity's forces sent a clear message throughout the galaxy. Other alien species watched with interest as humans prepared for what seemed like a hopeless war. The peaceful Mentari had never seen such a rapid military response to any threat. The trade-focused Corvani wondered if humans had lost their minds by choosing to fight instead of retreat. But something else was happening that the galaxy had never witnessed before. Human colonies that had been ordered to evacuate instead began preparing for war. Farmers and miners took up weapons and started building defensive positions. Civilian transports were converted into missile platforms. Children and elderly people were moved to underground shelters while everyone else prepared to fight. The response from human space was unlike anything the Zephyrians had expected. Their previous expansion campaigns had always succeeded because other species chose survival over resistance. When faced with superior technology and certain death, rational beings evacuated their territory and sought safety elsewhere. The collective had assumed that humans would make the same logical choice. Instead, reports reached the Zephyrian leadership that humans were actually moving more people and equipment to the threatened colonies. They were reinforcing worlds that had been marked for elimination. Military ships that should have been retreating toward Earth were instead taking defensive positions around the outer settlements. Crystalline Prime Vexithara studied these reports with growing confusion. The humans appeared to be preparing for a war they could not possibly win. Their technology was inferior, their numbers were smaller, and their military experience was limited to small conflicts and peacekeeping operations. By all logical calculations, they should have accepted the collective's generous offer to retreat to their home system. But logic and human nature did not always work together in predictable ways. The massacre at New Haven had awakened something in humanity that the Zephyrians did not understand. It was not just anger or the desire for revenge. It was the absolute refusal to accept that their existence was conditional on the approval of others. General Martinez coordinated the deployment of human forces across dozens of star systems. Every colony received military support and defensive equipment. Civilian populations were trained in emergency procedures and given weapons to defend themselves. The outer worlds became armed camps where humans waited for the Zephyrian attack. They knew was coming. The deadlines set by the collective approached, and it became clear that no human settlements would be evacuated. Instead of empty worlds, the Zephyrians would find 47 colonies filled with humans who had chosen to fight rather than run. The echo of New Haven's destruction had traveled across human space and returned as a declaration of war. The first major battle of the war began at the Kepler 442 system, where the agricultural colony of Harvest provided food for 12 other human settlements. Commander Steve Parker commanded the defense fleet of 8 ships against a Zephyrian, force 3 times larger. His orders were simple: hold the system at any cost and protect the 2 million colonists below. The Zephyrian fleet approached in perfect formation, their crystalline ships reflecting starlight like floating jewels. Their weapons had the power to crack planetary crusts, and their shields could absorb massive amounts of damage. Every tactical analysis suggested that the human defenders would be destroyed within hours of the first engagement. Steve Parker studied the enemy formation and made a decision that would be remembered throughout human history. Instead of fighting a traditional space battle where superior technology would decide the outcome, he ordered his ships to do something that no military doctrine had ever recommended. They would ram the enemy vessels at maximum speed while firing every weapon they possessed. The UES Defender led the charge directly into the center of the Zephyrian formation. Parker's ship took massive damage from energy weapons as it closed the distance, but it reached the enemy flagship and crashed into its hull with the force of a small asteroid. Both ships exploded in a ball of fire that lit up the darkness of space. The other human ships followed Parker's example and drove themselves into enemy vessels like guided missiles made of metal and fury. The Zephyrians had never encountered an enemy that treated their own ships as expendable weapons. Their tactical computers could not calculate responses to attacks that made no logical sense from a military perspective. Colonel Va. Amy Brooks commanded the Marine units aboard the human ships and led boarding parties against Zephyrian vessels that survived the ramming attacks. Her troops fought through corridors filled with deadly energy fields and automated defense systems. They discovered that the aliens, despite their advanced technology, had never faced enemies who fought with desperate courage in close combat. The Zephyrians were physically stronger and had better weapons, but they fought like machines following programmed responses. The human Marines fought like wild animals protecting their young. They used improvised explosives, hand weapons, and even their bare hands when ammunition ran out. Several Zephyrian ships were captured when their crews simply could not understand how to fight such irrational opponents. Dr. Alex Bennett was aboard the UES Horizon during the battle and made observations that would change everything. The Zephyrian energy shields were designed to absorb and deflect energy weapons, but they were not prepared for physical impacts at high velocity. The ramming attacks had caused more damage than hours of conventional weapons fire. More importantly, Bennett discovered that the Zephyrian technology relied on complex crystalline matrices that controlled their power systems. When these crystals were damaged by physical trauma, the entire ship lost power and became helpless. The aliens had built their technology to be efficient and beautiful, but not to survive the kind of brutal combat that humans were willing to engage in. The battle at Kepler 442 lasted 18 hours and ended with the retreat of the surviving Zephyrian ships. Half of the human fleet had been destroyed, but they had accomplished something that military experts had said was impossible. They had defeated a technologically superior enemy through tactics that bordered on controlled suicide. News of the victory spread through human space faster than light-speed communications could carry it. On Earth, Admiral Sullivan analyzed the battle reports and began developing new strategies based on Parker's breakthrough. If humans could not match Zephyrian technology, they would have to fight in ways that made technology less important. The quantum communication network carried news of the battle to every inhabited system in the galaxy. Other alien species monitored human transmissions with growing amazement as they heard reports of ships being used as weapons and Marines fighting with improvised equipment against superior enemies. The peaceful Mentari had never seen such displays of organized violence in service of survival. The Corvani Trade Federation found themselves in an unexpected position as neutral observers of the conflict. Their merchants had traded with both humans and Zephyrians for decades, but the massacre at New Haven had shocked them. When human representatives approached them for rare materials needed to build more ships, the Corvani faced a difficult decision. Officially, the Trade Federation remained neutral in the conflict. Unofficially, Corvani merchant ships began carrying unusual cargo to human space stations. Rare metals, energy crystals, and advanced components that could be used to upgrade human weapons found their way into the hands of military engineers, who asked no questions about their source. The Zephyrian Collective was disturbed by reports from the battle at Kepler 442. Supreme Crystalline Zarthek had expected swift victories followed by human surrender and evacuation. Instead, the humans had demonstrated a willingness to sacrifice everything rather than submit to genocide. Their tactics made no sense from a strategic perspective, but they were proving effective against collective forces. More Zephyrian fleets moved toward human space with orders to crush the resistance quickly and completely. The collective had resources and technology that humans could not match, but they were beginning to understand that this war would not be won easily. The humans were not fighting like a civilized species, seeking to minimize casualties and preserve their civilization. Commander Steve Parker's sacrifice at Kepler 442 became a symbol of human determination throughout the colonies. His last transmission before ramming the enemy flagship had been broadcast across the system. "This is for New Haven and for every human child who will grow up free." Those words were painted on ships, carved into memorial walls, and whispered as battle cries. Dr. Bennett's discoveries about Zephyrian technology led to rapid developments in human weapon design. If crystalline matrices were vulnerable to physical shock, then humans would build weapons that delivered maximum kinetic impact. Nuclear warheads were modified to create focused explosions that could shatter crystal structures. Kinetic projectiles were designed to penetrate energy shields through brute force rather than sophisticated technology. The war was expanding beyond the Kepler 442 system as both sides prepared for larger engagements. Human colonies fortified their defenses and prepared for siege warfare. Zephyrian fleets gathered in staging areas where they planned coordinated attacks on multiple systems. The galaxy watched as two very different approaches to warfare prepared to clash on a scale not seen for centuries. Amy Brooks recovered from her injuries and returned to duty with new insights about fighting Zephyrian forces in close combat. Her Marines had learned that the aliens relied heavily on energy weapons and were vulnerable to attacks that forced them into hand-to-hand fighting. Human training programs began focusing on boarding actions and urban combat tactics. The echo of humanity's wrath was growing louder with each battle. Other species were beginning to understand that something unprecedented was happening in this corner of the galaxy. A technologically inferior species was refusing to submit to genocide and was actually winning battles through sheer determination and tactical innovation. The war between humans and Zephyrians had been raging for 6 months, and its effects were being felt throughout the galaxy. On the peaceful world of Mentara Prime, the Council of Sages gathered in their crystal amphitheater to debate something they had never faced before. Sage Velmiran, eldest of their kind, studied reports of human tactics with growing concern and amazement. The Mentari had achieved peace by avoiding conflict whenever possible. When threatened by superior forces, they negotiated, retreated, or submitted rather than fight hopeless battles. They had survived for thousands of years by being reasonable and logical. The human response to Zephyrian aggression made no sense to their careful minds. Captain Jake Morrison had been promoted after his discovery at New Haven and now commanded the UES Defiance, one of the new warships built specifically for fighting Zephyrians. But today he was not hunting enemy fleets. Instead, he was docked at Corvani Station 7, trying to convince neutral species to support humanity's war effort. The Corvani had been secretly helping humans for months, but they wanted to make their support official. Trade Minister Vorthak explained that his people had been horrified by the genocide at New Haven. They had never seen such systematic murder of innocent civilians, and they feared that the Zephyrians might target other species if they succeeded. in destroying humanity. Morrison shared intelligence reports with the Corvani leaders that painted a disturbing picture. The Zephyrian Collective was not just expanding into human space. They were making territorial claims on worlds inhabited by other species as well. The massacre at New Haven had been a test to see how the galaxy would respond to genocide. If humanity fell, other species would face the same ultimatums. Director Karen Stone ran the Human Intelligence Service from a hidden base in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. Her agents worked throughout the galaxy, gathering information and building relationships with alien species who might become allies. The war had made her job both more difficult and more important than ever before. Stone's reports showed that the galaxy was dividing into three groups. Some species supported humanity openly, providing materials and safe harbor for human ships. Others remained neutral, but were clearly sympathetic to the human cause. A few species, mostly those with territorial ambitions of their own, quietly supported the Zephyrians or remained completely isolated from the conflict. Lieutenant Colonel Danny Walsh commanded the Human Research Station at Europa Base, where scientists worked around the clock to develop new weapons based on Dr. Bennett's discoveries about Zephyrian technology. The breakthrough had come when they learned to disrupt crystalline matrices using specific frequency combinations. Human energy weapons were finally becoming effective against Zephyrian shields. The new weapons were being deployed to human fleets throughout the outer colonies, but they came with a cost. The rare materials needed to build them were expensive and difficult to obtain. Each ship could only carry a limited number of these weapons, and they required constant maintenance by trained technicians. Humans were still fighting at a technological disadvantage, but the gap was finally beginning to close. On the Zephyrian homeworld of Crystallis, Supreme Crystalline Zarthek studied reports from the war with growing frustration. The human resistance should have collapsed months ago when their inferior technology met superior collective forces. Instead, the humans had adapted their tactics and were actually causing significant damage to Zephyrian fleets. The collective's expansion plans had called for the quick elimination of human colonies, followed by negotiations with other species for peaceful annexation of their territories. The prolonged war with humanity was disrupting these plans and making other species suspicious of Zephyrian intentions. Some alien governments were actually building up their own military forces in response to the conflict. Zarthek made a decision that would have major consequences for the war. The collective would commit their reserve fleets to a massive assault on human space. Instead of fighting dozens of small battles, they would concentrate their forces and crush human resistance in one overwhelming campaign. The humans would learn that determination alone could not overcome superior numbers and technology. The Mentari Council reached a decision that surprised everyone, including themselves. Sage Velmaran announced that his people would provide medical, aid, and humanitarian support to human colonies. They would not fight in the war, but they would help civilian populations survive the conflict. It was the first time in their history that the Mentari had taken sides in any military dispute. Trade Minister Vorthak made his own announcement on behalf of the Corvani Federation. His people would openly provide materials and logistical support to human forces. They would also offer safe passage through Corvani space for human ships seeking to avoid Zephyrian patrols. The Federation was officially joining the war on humanity's side. Captain Morrison received these announcements while his ship was resupplying at a hidden base in the Centauri system. For the first time since the war began, humans were not fighting alone. They had allies who were willing to risk Zephyrian retaliation to support their cause. The echo of humanity's resistance was inspiring other species to take stands of their own. Dr. Bennett had been transferred to a mobile research ship that followed human fleets into battle. His real-time analysis of Zephyrian technology was helping. Human commanders developed new tactics during actual combat. He had discovered that the aliens used predictable response patterns when their shields were disrupted, creating opportunities for follow-up attacks. The war was also changing human society in unexpected ways. Colonies that had focused on farming, mining, or manufacturing were becoming centers of military production. Civilian populations were learning to operate weapons and defensive systems. Children were being educated in schools that doubled as emergency shelters. Humanity was becoming a warrior species out of necessity. Colonel Amy Brooks had been promoted to lead all human ground forces and was developing new training programs based on her experience fighting Zephyrians in close combat. Her Marines were becoming famous throughout the galaxy for their willingness to board enemy ships and fight aliens hand-to-hand in zero gravity. Other species found such behavior both terrifying and admirable. The quantum communication networks carried stories of human courage to every inhabited world in the galaxy. Tales of ships being used as weapons, Marines fighting with improvised equipment, and civilians refusing to evacuate threatened colonies. Species that had never heard of humans before the war were learning about them through reports of their military actions. The galaxy had never seen anything like humanity's response to the Zephyrian threat. Other species facing superior enemies had always chosen survival over resistance. They had negotiated, retreated, or submitted rather than fight hopeless wars. Humans were proving that sometimes the impossible became possible when survival was not enough and freedom was worth dying for. Director Stone's intelligence reports showed that the war was having effects far beyond the immediate conflict between humans and Zephyrians. Other species were studying human tactics and considering how they might adapt them for their own defense. The idea that technological superiority could be overcome through determination and tactical innovation was spreading throughout the galaxy. The Zephyrian collective was beginning to understand that they had awakened something dangerous. Their calculated expansion plans were being disrupted by an enemy that refused to follow logical patterns of behavior. The humans were not just fighting for their own survival, but were inspiring other species to resist collective expansion. The war was becoming larger than anyone had anticipated. The greatest battle in human history began at dawn on the third moon of Proxima Centauri. Admiral Kate Sullivan stood on the bridge of the UES Vengeance and watched as the largest Zephyrian fleet ever assembled dropped out of hyperspace. 200 crystalline ships formed perfect battle lines across the system, their hulls reflecting the light of 3 different stars. This was the collective's final gambit to crush human resistance once and for all. Sullivan commanded every available human warship in the sector, but her fleet numbered only 60 vessels. Many were damaged from previous battles, and some were civilian ships hastily converted for military use. By every calculation of military science, the coming battle would be a massacre that would end human expansion beyond the Sol system forever. But humans had stopped caring about military calculations months ago. The crew of every ship in Sullivan's fleet had volunteered for what everyone knew would be a suicide mission. They sang ancient battle songs as they checked their weapons and prepared for combat. They painted the names of loved ones on their hulls and recorded final messages for families they would never see again. General Paul Martinez coordinated the ground defenses on Proxima Colony, where 500,000 humans had refused evacuation orders and prepared to fight to the last person. Civilian volunteers built barricades in the streets while children and elderly citizens took shelter in underground bunkers. Everyone who could hold a weapon stood ready to resist the Zephyrian landing forces that would follow the space battle. Zephyrian Commander, Prime Crystal Veltharian, opened communications with the human fleet and offered one final chance for surrender. If the humans would stand down immediately and begin evacuation procedures, the collective would allow them to retreat to Earth with minimal casualties. It was the last mercy they would be offered before the systematic destruction of their military forces. Admiral Sullivan's response became legendary throughout the galaxy. She told Veltharian that humans had learned an important lesson from the massacre at New Haven. Some things were worth dying for, and the right to exist was one of them. If the Zephyrians wanted human space, they would have to take it from the dead hands of every man, woman, and child who called it home. Captain Karen Phillips led the fighter squadrons in the opening assault. Her pilots flew modified civilian craft equipped with nuclear weapons and kinetic rams. They had trained for one mission: get close enough to Zephyrian ships to cause maximum damage before being destroyed. Their life expectancy in combat was measured in minutes, but they attacked with the fury of people defending their homes and families. The battle began with the largest ramming attack in military history. 30 human ships accelerated to maximum velocity and drove themselves directly into the Zephyrian formation. The aliens had prepared for this tactic, but they had not expected humans to use it on such a massive scale. The explosions lit up space like a chain of miniature suns as ships from both sides died in balls of fire and twisted metal. Dr. Bennett was aboard the command ship and monitored Zephyrian communications during the battle. For the first time since the war began, he detected something like confusion and fear in the alien transmissions. The collective forces had expected to face desperate resistance, but the sheer intensity of human attacks was beyond their calculations. Some Zephyrian ships were actually retreating from combat zones to regroup and assess the situation. Lieutenant Colonel Danny Walsh had positioned his new weapons throughout the system and coordinated their use during the battle. The frequency, disruptors that could shatter Zephyrian crystals, were finally being deployed in large numbers. Human ships that survived the initial exchange of fire used these weapons to devastating effect against enemy vessels with damaged shields. The space battle raged for 8 hours, but it was the communications that made it legendary throughout the galaxy. Other species monitoring the transmissions heard something they had never encountered before. Human crews were laughing as their ships burned around them. They were making jokes while ramming enemy vessels. They were singing as they charged into overwhelming firepower. Major Lisa Rodriguez led the Marine boarding parties that captured 3 Zephyrian ships during the height of the battle. Her troops fought through corridors filled with energy weapons and automated defenses while their own ship was being torn apart by enemy fire. When Prime Crystal Veltharion demanded to know why humans fought with such intensity, Rodriguez gave him an answer that would be remembered for generations. She told the alien commander that Zephyrians had made one crucial mistake in their calculations. They had assumed that humans were like other species who valued survival above all else. But humans had evolved from predators who fought over territory and resources. They had been shaped by millions of years of warfare, and peace was something they had learned, not something that came naturally to them. The ground battle on Proxima Colony became equally legendary when Zephyrian forces finally landed after the space engagement. General Martinez commanded civilian defenders who used improvised weapons and guerrilla tactics against armored alien troops. Factory workers built explosive devices from mining equipment. Farmers used agricultural chemicals to create toxic gas weapons. Teenagers who had been students the week before became snipers and saboteurs. The Zephyrians found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to follow any rules of civilized warfare. Humans used their own wounded as bait for ambushes. They booby-trapped their own homes and schools. They fought from sewers, rooftops, and underground tunnels that the aliens could not map or predict. Every building became a fortress, and every human became a potential weapon. Elder Sage Aerthion of the Mentari Council later described the Battle of Proxima Centauri as the moment when the galaxy realized that humans were not fighting a war, in the traditional sense. They were making a statement that would echo across the stars for centuries. They were declaring that some principles were more important than survival, and that genocide would always be met with total resistance. The Zephyrian fleet began to break apart after 12 hours of continuous combat. Their crystalline ships were designed for elegant warfare between civilized species who followed predictable patterns of behavior. They were not prepared for enemies who treated death as just another tactic and who fought with religious intensity for their right to exist. Supreme. Crystalline Zarthak himself arrived on the battlefield aboard the Collective's most powerful vessel and demanded a personal meeting with Admiral Sullivan. The human commander agreed to the meeting, but insisted that it take place aboard the captured Zephyrian flagship where Major Rodriguez had taken control. The alien leader would have to face the reality of what his war of extermination had created. The meeting between Zarthek and Sullivan took place in a ship's corridor still scarred by energy weapons and stained with the blood of both species. The Zephyrian leader had come to offer new terms for human surrender, but he found himself facing something he had never encountered before. Sullivan was not interested in negotiating for survival. She wanted to discuss the terms of Zephyrian withdrawal from human space. Captain Jake Morrison arrived with reinforcements from Earth just as the main battle was ending. His ships were loaded with the newest human weapons and crews trained specifically for fighting Zephyrians. But more importantly, they carried news that the war was spreading beyond human space. 3 other species had declared war on the collective after witnessing the Battle of Proxima Centauri. The echo of humanity's defiance had traveled across the galaxy and inspired other species to resist Zephyrian expansion. The Corvani had attacked. Collective mining operations in their territory, the Mentari had provided military intelligence to collective enemies. Even peaceful species were building weapons and preparing for war rather than submit to genocide. Zarthek realized that the collective had created a problem much larger than the human war. Their campaign of extermination had awakened something in the galaxy that had been sleeping for centuries. The idea that superior technology could not overcome determined resistance was spreading from species to species. The carefully planned expansion of the collective was collapsing into a multi-front war against enemies who had learned from human tactics. The war ended not with a great final battle, but with a simple announcement broadcast across the galaxy. Supreme Crystalline Zarthek informed all collective forces that they were withdrawing from human space immediately and would seek expansion opportunities in other regions of the galaxy. The cost of conquering humanity had become greater than any possible benefit from occupying their worlds. Ambassador Lisa Carter stood before the Galactic Assembly for the first time as a representative of humanity. The Great Hall housed delegates from over 200 species, many of whom had never seen a human before the war began. The scars on her face and hands told the story of a species that had faced extinction and chosen to fight rather than submit to genocide. Her speech became known throughout the galaxy as the Iron Promise. Carter declared that humanity would never again allow genocide to go unanswered, regardless of who the victims might be. Human ships would patrol the galaxy watching for species that used superior technology to murder innocent civilians. The massacre at New Haven had taught humanity that evil unopposed would spread like a disease across the stars. Captain Jake Morrison, now promoted to Admiral, established the first Deep Space Monitor station in the ruins of the New Haven system. The base was built from the wreckage of Zephyrian ships destroyed during the war and served as a monument to the 40,000 humans who had died there. It would also serve as humanity's eyes and ears in a galaxy where some species still believed that might made right. The Monitor network grew quickly as human ships took positions throughout known space. They were not an invasion force or a colonial fleet. They were watchmen, whose mission was to observe and report any signs of genocide or systematic oppression. The galaxy learned that humans meant what they said when 3 different conflicts were stopped by the arrival of human warships. Dr. Alex Bennett published his research on Zephyrian technology and made it available to any species that wanted to defend themselves against technologically superior enemies. His work showed that advanced technology often had weaknesses that could be exploited by determined opponents using unconventional tactics. The research became required reading at military academies throughout the galaxy. The Mentari Council established a formal alliance with humanity based on their shared commitment to preventing genocide. Sage Velmiran explained that his people had learned something important from watching humans fight the Zephyrians. Sometimes peace could only be preserved by those willing to fight for it. The Mentari would provide medical aid and humanitarian support, while humans provided military protection. The Corvani Trade Federation signed exclusive trade agreements with human colonies and began sharing advanced technologies that had previously been restricted to their own people. Trade Minister Vorthak said that humanity had earned the right to these technologies through their willingness to fight for the freedom of all species. The Federation would help humans build the ships and weapons needed to patrol the galaxy. Colonel Amy Brooks established the first interspecies military academy on the moon of Europa, where humans would train soldiers from other species in the tactics that had proven effective against technologically superior enemies. Her Marines had become legendary throughout the galaxy for their boarding actions and close combat techniques. Other species wanted to learn how to fight with the same intensity and effectiveness. The Zephyrian Collective retreated to the far edge of the galaxy and began a period of internal restructuring. The war with humanity had shattered their belief in their own superiority and forced them to reconsider their expansion methods. Some collective members argued for developing even more advanced technology to ensure future victories. Others suggested that perhaps expansion through peaceful means might be more effective than genocide. Director Karen Stone's intelligence network had grown to include agents and allies from dozens of different species. Her reports showed that the war had fundamentally changed galactic politics in ways that no one had anticipated. Species that had previously been enemies were now cooperating against potential genocidal threats. The galaxy was becoming more unified in its opposition to systematic oppression. Lieutenant Colonel Danny Walsh continued his research into advanced weapons technology at installations throughout human space. The frequency disruptors that had helped win the war were being improved and miniaturized for use by other species. He also worked on defensive systems that could protect civilian populations from energy weapons like those used at New Haven. The ruins of New Haven were preserved as a memorial to the victims of genocide and a warning to any species that might consider similar actions. Visitors from throughout the galaxy came to see the empty city and read the names of the 40,000 humans who had died there. The memorial became a pilgrimage site for those who believed that some principles were worth dying for. Captain Tony Morgan took command of the UES Vigilance, the newest and most advanced ship in the Monitor network. His orders were to investigate reports of potential atrocities in the distant Vega sector, where refugee populations were being threatened by a militant species called the hegemony. The report suggested that history might be repeating itself in a different part of the galaxy. The Vigilance arrived at the Vega system to find refugee ships under attack by hegemony forces using weapons designed to cause maximum suffering rather than quick death. The attackers were forcing civilian populations to watch the torture and murder of their leaders as a warning to other species in the region. It was genocide with a different name, but the same evil purpose. Morgan's response was swift and decisive. The human ship appeared between the hegemony fleet and the refugee vessels and broadcast a simple message. Any further attacks on civilian targets would be met with the full response of humanity and its allies. The Monitor network was calling for reinforcements, and the Galactic Assembly was being notified of crimes against sentient life. The hegemony commander demanded to know by what authority humans interfered in local conflicts. Morgan's reply became part of the legend of humanity's role as galactic guardians. He said that the authority came from 40,000 graves on New Haven and from every species in the galaxy that had chosen freedom over submission. Humanity had appointed itself the enemy of genocide, and that appointment was permanent. The standoff lasted 3 days before Mentari medical ships, Corvani supply vessels, and warships from 6 different species arrived to support the human Monitor ship. The refugee fleet was safely escorted to sanctuary worlds, while the hegemony forces retreated to avoid a war they could not win. The galaxy had learned that threatening innocent civilians would bring swift and overwhelming response. Dr. Bennett observed that humanity's response to the New Haven massacre had created something unprecedented in galactic history. A species had voluntarily taken on the role of protector for other species without demanding tribute, territory, or submission in return. The echo of humanity's wrath had become a permanent part of the galaxy's political structure. The deep space monitor network continued to expand as more human ships took positions throughout known space. Each station was built from the wreckage of defeated oppressors and served as both memorial and warning. The galaxy learned that genocide would never again go unanswered as long as humans had ships to send and warriors willing to crew them. Admiral Morrison received his final orders from Earth Command as he prepared to establish the most distant monitor station yet attempted. The mission would take him beyond the edge of known space to investigate reports of systematic extermination in the unexplored regions of the galaxy. Humanity's watch would continue to expand until every innocent life in the universe was protected from those who would destroy it. The silence that had fallen on New Haven 3 years earlier had been answered with thunder that echoed across the stars. The galaxy had learned that some species would fight for principles greater than survival, and that evil could be defeated by those willing to pay any price to stop it. Humanity's wrath would continue to echo across the stars as long as innocence needed protection, and tyrants needed to be reminded that their power had limits.